Production funding for Arts Upload has been provided in part by Francis Family Foundation, Hall Family Foundation, the H&R Block Foundation, Courtney S. Turner Charitable Trust, John W. and FEE Spies Memorial Trust, Muriel McBrien Kaufman Foundation, and viewers like you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Randy Mason.
And I'm Maris Aylward.
Our show's called Arts Upload, and this week we're taking it easy here at the new Screenland Crossroads.
We've got some non-killer bees and a painter whose work is starting to get noticed.
Plus a mysterious disappearance and some very cool clouds.
It's all ahead on The Upload.
Jarrett Mullenbrook is a Kansas City artist whose work takes various forms.
You might remember his public art piece called Float, where he placed hammocks out on the green space behind Bartle Hall.
And though you might not realize it as you drive past them, pieces of a project he calls Haven are another way he's devised to get you thinking.
Thinking about bees and their dwindling numbers around the world, Haven is designed to be a nationwide network of 1,000 working beehive sculptures.
Producer-videographer Justin Bond has more on this artist whose motto might be, "Simplicity is complexity resolved."
I have what I would call a transdisciplinary practice. I move between mediums, inspirations, purposes, reasons. I don't tend to question why I want to make something. I just make it, and then I kind of figure out how it fits together with other things that I've made later. In the different way that works manifest themselves in my studio, some are just of the moment assemblages, purely visually aesthetic or symbolic. Haven is the first project in what I think will be a lifelong work of mine, which I call the Deep Ecology Project. Haven has a functionality, the conventional aesthetics of the work, what it's made of, how it looks, those are all important. But what it comes down to is what the piece says, what the piece is communicating, and how its functionality is an important part of that.
So I'm an artist and a third-generation beekeeper, and I grew up around bees, and there's been a big change in beekeeping practices that I felt I could address with this project. As a sculptor and a public artist, I fused those two interests together and created this project. So the hive's pretty heavy. It's filled with honeycomb and honey. Bees like their hive entrance to face south or southeast. So every site where Haven is installed, you'll notice that it'll be facing southeast. In order to make it as easy as possible to install, the only tool you need is one wrench, powerful magnets that are embedded in these panels. Let them snap right together.
Around 100 years ago, Brancusi said, "Simplicity is complexity resolved." And the pollinator issue, the decline in the honeybees, and the threats that face all the pollinators right now is extremely complex. So what I wanted to do was to create something which was as elegant and simple as possible. It has the potential to give bees what they need, and it has the potential to act as a tool to give us what we need to understand better what's happening.
With the decimation of the population right now, it's very important for us to look at what's happening in the wild and what keys there might be to these survivor bees. If we've lost 80 to 90% of bees in the wild, these 10 to 20% that are still living, to me, are really important. Honeybees are responsible for pollinating a third of the food that we eat. If the bees go, we lose that food, and that has profound ripple effects. And this is a pretty important food security issue. part of the process of installing these hives is also in catching the wild honeybees, which I do in the spring. If it were a bigger branch, I would just pound the branch or shake it and have the bees fall into the bucket. I'm going to just try to take the whole branch that the bees are on. That's why I'm removing as much of it as possible. Then I'll just put the little piece of the branch in the bucket and take it with me. Then when I install the bees in the hive, I'll take the branch out. Oh, didn't go quite as smoothly as I hoped. That's why I put the tarp down. The queen is somewhere in this mess of bees, and we hope that she's in the bucket. If she's not and she's on the tarp, the bees will join her. If she's in the bucket, the bees will join her in there. These bees are going to be going into a Haven hive at a private residence.
Here in Kansas City, I have Haven hives in both public and private locations. We have hives at Hyde Park, the DST Garden at 18 Broadway, Kauffman Memorial Garden, the Kauffman Foundation, Johnson County Community College, Nerman Museum's collection, which will also be on the Johnson County Community College campus. At each Haven site, there is a title plaque with a QR code. The title plaque describes to park visitors what they're looking at. The QR code takes them to a website with a survey page. The website gives them more in-depth information as to what's happening to the honeybees and what this project is all about. And the survey page allows them to make their own observations and upload that information to the website to help crowdsource this data gathering. It allows visitors to engage with the project at any level they want. Can even serve as a tool for educators that want to take a class of kids out to see what's going on and learn about why pollinators are important.
These are the bees that are spreading the scent to tell all the other bees that this is the place to come. The queen is in here, come and join us. If you sit here for a while, eventually you'll just see all the bees in the air and the tarp kind of come inside and join them in the bucket.
The bees pretty much just want to ignore us, and we're not really on their radar. What they're looking for are flowers. They are not prone to attacking and chasing down people.
Couldn't talk with the bee on my lip.
It was important to make the hive in a way that would allow visitors to any urban park feel comfortable in its proximity. At this height, at 16 feet, this is a way for us to be able to integrate them into our urban and suburban environments and make them part of our ecosystem. Public realm is a great place to play with art, and this project gives me a great chance to step out of the gallery walls, to step out of the institution, to interface with my art and a general public directly. And to me, that's become a very valuable part of my practice.
Beehive sculptures are pretty uncommon, but painters, especially here in America's creative crossroads, are a lot more prevalent.
This week on Arts Upload, we'll introduce you to an emerging artist whose work is starting to get a lot of positive attention.
His name is Kwanzaa Humphrey, and the portraits he paints have been featured in shows at the Kansas City Artists Coalition and the Kemper Albrecht Museum in St. Joe.
Kwanzaa draws and paints at his studio in Shawnee, which is where producer-videographer Julie Denichet watched him doing his work.
I like to draw people, portraits, faces. I'm just really kind of drawn to people and different kinds of people from all walks of life. I've always wanted to get to know people and wanted to kind of know their stories and what they're all about. And I think what I try and capture is not just that person, but something that's universal to kind of humanity and to everyone. I get something from being able to kind of put what's in my head and what I see, you know, in the world around me onto, you know, a piece of paper or a canvas. I remember my first drawing when I was in kindergarten at 5, and you know how you lay your hand down on a piece of paper and you trace it, and then, I mean, it looks like a hand, and that works. So I tried to do the same thing with this little car, and so I laid it on its side and I traced it, and I mean, it's not a flat, you know, thing like your hand is, so it's not as easy to trace. And I got done with the drawing, I was like, this doesn't look anything like I want it. So I set it down and I just kind of looked at it and started drawing it. And then from that point on, I always try to interpret it, you know, kind of through my eyes. One of my signatures is the way that I use color. I don't mix a lot of colors on my palette. I like to use kind of straight color and optically blend them on the canvas. I start with the black and white, like the drawings here, and get my kind of composition and my values set up. And then it's really kind of I let the subject matter inform, you know, kind of where I'm going to go with the colors. A lot of times I'll take, I don't know, you know, 2 or 3 months where I'm not really painting, or I may not even be drawing, but it's like the wheels are constantly churning, and I'm soaking in, you know, ideas and in my environment, and subconsciously thinking about the next thing I'm going to do. And how it all starts is I see things that are just like, man, I really want to capture that, and I can experience that feeling. And so hopefully I can get that, you know, capture that in in a way that I can, you know, give it to others and then let other people kind of experience that same feeling that I felt.
I met Kwanzaa 2.5 years ago approximately. I think he's a good painter, but he would show me a sketchbook and say, what do you think of this and this? And I was so charmed by his sketches, that's why we decided to have the sketchbook show. I think he's got a great way of covering a person's personality. They're not exact drawings of these people. He's got a couple of me, and they're certainly not exact, but they capture the essence of the people. And some of them are strangers, some of them are people he knows, and I think they're just charming.
I'm 40 now, and I've always been doing art to a certain extent, and it's whether it's, you know, graphic design, that's kind of my day job that pays the bills, and I'm at a point now in some of my fine art that it can start to pay for itself, you know. And as much as I was drawing, as much as I love that, when I got back into painting, you know, I was like, man, I really love this. It's a challenge for me to kind of get it to the vision that I want, and the more I'm doing it, the better I'm starting to feel about the way that I'm painting now. There's like that mechanism that's always seems to be on, that I'm always kind of observing, and a lot of times I think that's kind of like who I am. It's being present and in the moment, and really kind of capturing kind of what's there. Really, that's what art is about, you know, for me, you know, is being able to see. And not necessarily just see what's in front of you, but kind of see, you know, beyond that initial layer, and capture, see the emotion, see kind of what's just below the surface. And I think, you know, when you see that far, then that's when you can start creating things that connect with other people.
We're talking arts this week from the Screenland Theater in the Crossroads. But if you were to go looking for it in the original location, well, it's not there anymore.
This new version is on the east edge of the district, and hey, they've expanded quite a bit. There's even a tapcade back here now.
Craft beers and video arcade games to go along with movies. Called Tuesday speaks for itself, don't you think?
And on Thursdays, the Geeks Who Drink Trivia. Of course, if you're up north, Greenland Armor is doing beer and movies as well.
Okay, our next story is about pictures, but not the moving kind.
Louisiana photographer A.J. Meek combines these amazing shots of clouds he has with poems written by kids. Take a look.
Charlie Brown and Linus were lying on their back looking up at the sky, looking at the clouds, and Linus says, I think I see Beethoven writing his Fifth Symphony, and Charlie Brown says, all I see is a horsey.
The sky is an ever-changing abstraction in A.J. Meek's latest book, where photographs of clouds are paired with the observations of children.
The idea of this book on clouds, you know, it was a little intimidating at first because, you know, every artist, photographer that's been trained knows about the work that Stieglitz did. Any other artist that photographs a similar subject matter is, you know, has a certain trepidation of fear associated with photographing the sky.
His inspiration for the book came while he was in New Mexico.
Yeah, I had retired from LSU in School of Art and Photography in 2005, and I was teaching in the honors program at the University of New Mexico, and it was a real great time. We had a great time, but you know, I could not avoid, you know, seeing, you know, and being influenced by the sky in New Mexico. It's so beautiful with those cobalt blue skies and this really, really intense light. I was inspired by that sky and I started making photographs. When I got back to Louisiana, I continued the project. What I wanted to do is I wanted to include the perceptions of hope by children, and those were done by family and friends. I asked them first, of course, and I didn't want to include the pictures for the children to see to illustrate, so I gave them key words such as angels, and, you know, donuts, you know, whatever, and some things like that, and then they responded to that.
A donut tastes like sugar made from happiness.
I was also helped out a lot by the Runnels School here in Baton Rouge, and the English professors gave an assignment to their students.
Windy clouds, cotton balls on a string, pulled by time, pushed by wind, float overhead, held in the sky by the push of wind. This work was inspired by the Native American concept of a sacred space. It's a place that they go to, you know, they can commune with nature, and they can't really hold any kind of negative thought while they're observing a sacred mountain or a sacred place. The same was true for me with the title, The Healing Presence, as a concept that I wanted to put forth is when you look at these photographs, you know, you can't hold a negative thought. And then when you read the children's perceptions, you know, you get more information. And that was based on that idea. The illuminating presence of the sky is what helps us stay alive. Up above is where they float. The sky, the sea, the clouds, a boat. Meek has authored 6 books of photography. His penchant for landscapes has been a recurring theme in his work.
You know, I've always considered myself a documentary photographer, you know, with an artistic bent. What that means exactly is that, you know, I'm really concerned with what is before the camera, using the camera to record, you know, things in front of the camera. And that's kind of documentary. It's kind of artistic if you use the light properly. And so those are the kind of things that I really found myself interested in.
Angels have halos, wings, white dresses, and yellow shoes.
Some people ask me, do I miss the old analog photography, the old darkrooms? And you know, seriously speaking, I mean, I'm really grateful for getting out of that. I really like darkroom work, but I really am grateful for, you know, the advancements of technology, because digital photography is less polluting than the old way. A photographer, you know, uses heavy metals and very polluting darkroom chemicals, and the old way, you know, even though it's quite beautiful, I'm grateful that, you know, I no longer work in the darkroom. Those were really pretty rough days.
If I were a cloud, I'd soar above the world with all the freedom I could imagine, just waiting for the wind to take me somewhere new.
Especially after my retirement from LSU, I wanted to use my work, my talent, as a kind of a ministry. I mean, in a way, because it's something I couldn't do or didn't feel like I really could do, as an academic teacher or photographer. And so now that I've retired, I feel like I can really open up a little bit more and show some of the spiritual side of my nature and some of the spiritualness of the work that I'm trying to do.
Heaven is above the clouds, and there's houses and buildings there, and our kitties.
We have just enough time to share one more short story with you. In the spirit of detective films, journalist Carl Hoffman tells how a true-life mystery was solved: the 1961 disappearance of 23-year-old Michael Rockefeller, who went missing on his way to buy art for the family museum.
Michael Rockefeller was the son of Nelson Rockefeller, who was the governor of New York. He was 23 years old, had just graduated from Harvard University. His father had started the Museum of Primitive Art in 1957. Michael was in New Guinea collecting primitive art for his father's museum, and he vanished, was never seen again. And that was in November of 1961. There was this enormous 2-week search and rescue effort, and nothing was found. Soon after that, some missionaries on the ground who lived in the villages and spoke local languages heard rumors that Michael had in fact been killed by the local people, the Asmat. Oh God, how do I describe my book? I don't know. I mean, it's a murder mystery that's not much of a mystery. I say what happened to Michael Rockefeller in the first 10 pages. Spent 300 pages really saying why. Asmat are pretty complex, have, rich, complex culture. Art is a huge part of that. That's why Michael Rockefeller was there, and it's all based on headhunting and cannibalism. Cannibalism's a byproduct of the headhunting. It's not because they just want to go get some meat, need a burger and go kill somebody. They lived in a world that was this sort of dualistic world of extremes in which life was balanced by death and death by life. So they were in this sort of endless cycle of inter-village warfare and violence and reciprocation of trying to balance the world all the time. One of the first key thing we found with the documents, for instance, was reports of this Dutch raid. A zealous patrol officer named Max Lepre had been to the village and wanted to punish it for headhunting raids. And he had gone in, he was very afraid, scared of the Asmat, scared of this village in particular. And he panicked and opened fire, and he killed 5 people. And really, he killed 4 of the most important men in the whole village, and that had created a great imbalance. And that was always said to be the beginning, really, of the backstory that led to Michael's death. Although Michael is the central character of the book, and the book is about Michael's disappearance, in some ways he's the least important character of the book, ultimately. I mean, becomes so much of a story about the Asmat. I think I want readers to walk away from Savage Harvest having a deep appreciation for the Asmat and for the complexities of human nature and human culture. It's important to say that Asmat were cannibals, but are not any longer. They say time pretty much disappears when you're inside the theater, and once again, half an hour has flown right by.
Next week, the Arts Upload juggernaut rolls on with Rachel Ignatowski and her very cool designs.
Also designing a new and better Nutcracker with the Kansas City Ballet.
Till then, I'm Mara Saylor.
And I'm Randy Mason. Thanks for watching.
Production funding for Arts Upload has been provided in part by Francis Family Foundation, Hall Family Foundation, the H&R Block Foundation, Courtney S. Turner Charitable Trust, John W. and FEE Spies Memorial Trust, Muriel McBrien Kaufman Foundation, and viewers like you. Thank you.